Hey guys, I'm Heidi Priebe. Welcome back to my channel, or welcome if this is your first time here. On this channel, we talk about different psychological concepts and models that help us understand ourselves and other people better so that we can have more fulfilling and overall better lives and relationships. And by better, I mean getting more of what we do want out of our lives and relationships and less of what we don't want. Today, we're talking about the concept of limerence. If that term is brand new to you, I do have a video that goes over what it means and some signs that you might be experiencing it. So I will link that in the description of this video. You can go watch it and then make your way back here. If this is a term that's already familiar to you, what we're going to be going over today is how many of us use limerence as a means of self-regulation. And I think that this is a really important thing to contextualize if this is what we're doing. Because as with any psychological block or thing that is getting in our way of having happier and healthier lives, if we are not naming it properly, we're not really able to tackle it effectively. And a lot of the time when we are limerent, what we think we're doing is speculating about developing a close connected relationship with someone, when what we're actually doing is soothing some sort of negative emotional state that's arriving for us in the moment with a romantic fantasy. So expecting to form a close, connected, loving relationship in reality through limerence is kind of like expecting to make a baby through masturbation. It might feel like a similar act, but it does not at all produce the same result. So today we're going to look at 5 signs that you might be using limerence as a means of self-regulation. Before we get into those, I will quickly go over what I mean when I say self-regulation. So co-regulation in the psychological sense means managing our emotional or physiological state through connection with another person. So this can be as simple as talking to a friend when you're stressed out and noticing that your stress level starts to decrease as you're speaking with them. They're mirroring you back to yourself. It could mean going in for a prolonged hug with a loved one and noticing your body start to relax the longer you stay with that physical touch. So co-regulation is a very wonderful and important part of life, as is self-regulation. So self-regulation, in the psychological sense of the term, is managing our emotional and physiological state without input from another person. So the parallel examples here might be journaling out your feelings when you're feeling stressed out and overwhelmed, and noticing that the more you name your own feelings and sit with them, the more your state starts to change. Or taking a warm bath, or feeding yourself a meal that you enjoy, or doing exercise when you're in some sort of uncomfortable physiological state that returns you to a more comfortable state. Both self and co-regulation are very important parts of being alive. However, some of us have learned to over-rely on one or the other, or in certain areas we might over-rely on one or the other. So maybe we're perfectly comfortable seeking out help and support at work, but not in our romantic relationships, or vice versa. In most areas of life, it's very important to develop discernment around when co-regulation is the best overall choice for both ourselves and the other people we're seeking it out from, and when we need self-regulation. And often, limerence comes up when what we're craving is co-regulation, but there's some sort of block in the way of us feeling like we can get it. So maybe we're experiencing toxic shame, and going to another person and telling them what we're going through and experiencing feels way too vulnerable, and we feel like we would be rejected. So limerence can be this way of self-regulating and imagining the sense of connection that we're seeking in a way that changes our physiological state or our emotional state temporarily and can help kind of return us to baseline. Now, where we get into trouble is when we're being limerent, but we're not aware that what we're doing is using it as a self-regulatory tool. Then we start thinking, okay, reality needs to start resembling my fantasy in order for me to feel okay, not recognizing that the fantasy was all we really needed in that moment. Now, once again, limerence is to love what masturbation is to sex. It might feel similar to the real thing. However, it is not the real thing. The problem is that we don't usually mix up masturbation and sex. We usually know when we're doing which one. With limerence and love, a lot of us are very quick to mix those things up. We might think that thinking these limerent thoughts about somebody is loving them, when in reality, all we're doing is soothing ourselves. So what we're going to do now is go into 5 signs that you might be using limerence as a means of self-regulation. Because, like with anything, our problems tend to get better once we give them the accurate name. So we're going to talk now about how to do that. Sign number 1 that you are using limerence as a means of self-regulation is that you have a terrible fear of reality intruding upon your fantasy world, to the point where you might actually experience significant anxiety around the thought of spending too much time or learning too much about the person who you have limerence around, because you might be unconsciously terrified that you're going to find something out about them that you don't want to know, because it will be incompatible with the fantasy that you have about them. Insecure relationships, so relationships that are based in reality and are mostly about true in-the-moment connection. All information about the other is welcomed in, including the information we don't really like. And the reason why it's important, if you're building a secure connection, to welcome in both good and bad information about the other is because the end goal of secure connections is making informed decisions about who we want to spend our time with. And if we're looking for a committed long-term romantic partnership, making sure that the person we're committing to is someone who shares our true values and wants inside of a relationship. So finding something out like this person isn't really a relationship person would probably be a very valuable piece of information to know if you're looking for a committed long-term relationship. However, if you are limerent about the person, if what you are doing is using the thought of this person and romantic fantasies about them as a means of self-regulation, you're going to get really good at pushing out of your awareness any information that does not conform to the fantasy you're having. So rather than keeping a kind of running tally on ways in which you are and are not aligned with this person, or things you do and don't like about them, or ways in which you are and are not compatible, you're going to be only looking for pieces of information in your interactions with them that give you better fodder for your fantasies. And I want to point out that this is not something you are consciously doing. In another video, we'll talk about why some of us develop limerence from a very young age and how it's actually psychologically adaptive when we have difficult childhoods. So this isn't to shame or blame you if you realize that this is what you're doing. It's just something to be aware of. When I'm interacting with my limerent object, am I actually open to learning things about them that I might not like, or that might change my perception of our compatibility? And am I letting that information change the way I think about them? So if I find out some way in which we're not compatible, now when the interaction's over and I go home and think about them, am I factoring in that information because I'm forming a realistic picture of what a life with this person would look like? Or am I finding a way to romanticize even the red flags? Because our connection in reality is not as important to me as the connection that I am imagining inside of my mind that I'm using to self-regulate when I am alone. Sign number 2 that you're probably using limerence to self-regulate is that you go through significant periods of being more and less limerent and you don't know why. So when we are going through, let's say, major life changes, when we are grieving a loss, when we are trying to grapple with something that has happened to us that we don't know how to make sense of, what we tend to need during those periods is a lot of comfort. If we don't know how to ask for comfort or how to seek out comfort interpersonally, so if we don't know how to get secure, consistent co-regulation, what we're going to do is try to start comforting ourselves through any means possible. And limerence, the fixation on getting the attention and validation of another person, and then having a rich inner fantasy world about it, can be a really huge, maladaptive, but nonetheless temporarily effective dose of comfort when we are going through a difficult period. So what I encourage you to do if you're someone who has struggled with limerence is look back over your life and just notice the periods in which you were particularly limerent. What else was going on for you? Had you just moved to a new city? Had you just gone through a breakup? Had you lost someone in the recent past? When I look back on my own life, the most limerent period I ever went through was a period after which I had experienced 2 major losses in very quick succession. And it was like my mind just could not handle that, did not know who to go to for support, and became limerent as hell for about a year. And I think this is something that it's worth having some compassion for ourselves around. I kind of look at limerence as this magic fairy pixie dust that some of us just sprinkle on top of the crap in our lives. Is this the most adaptive way of coping with the crap? Absolutely not. But if you don't have better coping mechanisms available to you, it is a way of getting yourself through it. So in order to start figuring out what your triggers are, what things might happen in your life that can flip you quickly into limerence, you're going to want to look at when it has come up for you in the past and start noticing any patterns you're able to around when you became the most limerent historically. Sign number 3 that you're using limerence as a means of self-regulation is that you feel whole and lovable and complete in your own limerent fantasies in a way that you don't in your everyday life. So once again, when a secure person is forming a connection with someone, there isn't necessarily a huge difference in the way that they think of themselves when they're alone versus the way that they think of themselves when they're with this other person. They have that I'm okay, you're okay worldview. So there isn't this sense of I'm only okay and I only like myself if this person approves of me and loves me back. There's a sense of I want this person to approve of me and like me back if I like them, because then maybe we could be close and that would be nice. However, if that isn't the way they feel about me, it's not going to change the way I feel about myself. I'm going to like myself and respect myself just as much if this person decides they don't want to be with me than if they do. Even if my feelings get a little hurt or it sucks a little bit in the process. But it's not going to fundamentally mess with my idea of how I think about myself. Now, those who experience a lot of limerence are often using limerent fantasies as an escape from toxic shame. So the way that you feel when you are not engaged in these limerent thoughts, or when you are not able to seek some sort of small confirmation that maybe this person is interested in you or likes you back or is paying attention to you in the same way that you're paying attention to them, you're likely to feel significantly different. Because the difference between toxic shame and a reprieve from toxic shame is a night and day emotional state. So when you are using limerent fantasies as a mental and emotional reprieve from toxic shame, you are probably imagining a world that includes a very idealized version of both the other person and yourself. You're seeing them as almost perfect and more than human, and you're seeing yourself as finally lovable and worthy by virtue of the fact that they think that of you. So there's this sense in your fantasy world of finally being someone who you can accept and you can love just for who you are, because you are giving yourself permission to feel that through this other person's approval. When in reality, when you step away from that fantasy, when you imagine what it would be like if in real life the other person did not return your affections, you might find yourself kind of engulfed in that sense of toxic shame, that inability to be present with and accepting of yourself. And again, this is not a moral failing, it is often the product of early wounding and the responses we develop to that wounding as children that were once adaptive but can become maladaptive in adulthood. But the main thing to pay attention to at this point is in your romantic fantasies, in your limerent thoughts, when you get that confirmation that, ooh, maybe this person is interested in me, how different is that feeling from the way that you normally feel? And the bigger the discrepancy that exists, the more likely it is that you're using these limerent fantasies as a means of self-regulating. When you're feeling extreme toxic shame, you need to imagine something extraordinarily, overwhelmingly positive to kind of balance out that emotional state. And the good and the bad news is that this end of the extreme, this redemption fantasy, this savior fantasy of someone being capable of solving the way that you feel about yourself, is not true. However, this end of the spectrum, where you believe that you are inherently worthless and unworthy of love, is equally untrue. In the middle is the secure self concept, where you're able to accept yourself both for your good and your bad traits. However, of course, there's a very long road to get there for many of us. And what we're talking about here is step 1, which is just making ourselves aware of the patterning that we currently have. Sign number 4 that you're probably using limerence as a means of self-regulation is that you prefer reflecting on the interactions you've had with your limerent object more than you enjoy actually having them in real time. So again, secure connection is all about showing up with presence and acceptance of the present moment and being engaged in real time with the people who were around. So when you are forming a secure connection with someone, the best part of the connection is actually being with them in real time and experiencing the full range of feelings that come up when you are with them. When you are limerent, the best part of a connection is going home and metabolizing all of the things the other person said and did into your fantasy world. So maybe they looked at you a certain way, they smiled at you a certain way, and in the moment that made you feel kind of happy and excited. But if you're limerent, the main reason it made you feel happy and excited was not just because you felt connected and warm towards them in the moment. It's because it gave you fodder to go home and imagine all of the things that they might have been thinking about you in that moment, to build layers of interpretation on top of what that smile or what that kind comment meant, to construct this kind of rich fantasy world about what the other person might be thinking about you, and all of those tiny interpretations you can make about what they said and did in real time. Now, is it within the range of secure relating to wonder about what people meant when they said or did certain things? Absolutely. However, with Limerence, this tendency is taken to an extreme. So you can make almost anything, almost any tiny interaction mean something humongous inside of your own mind. So what you want to be very aware of here is what is the discrepancy between what happened in reality and what you made it mean. If what happened in reality is you had a coffee date with someone and it seemed like you had a good conversation, and what's happening in your fantasy world is you are getting married in a hot air balloon in a foreign country, it's probable that you're experiencing quite a bit of limerence. And another key tell of limerence is that you tend to be very anxious about being around the person. Because again, back to point number one, you're worried that they might say or do something that breaks this fantasy that you have about them. And so you might feel a sense of relief when your real life interaction with them is over, because now you can go back to where you like to be, which is in your fantasy world. As opposed to in a secure connection, you're going to enjoy the connection the most when it's actually happening. And when it's not happening, you're not going to put too much thought into extrapolating upon it. You're just going to maybe look forward to seeing them next and have a reasonable amount of curiosity about what that's going to look like. Because the part that you're actually siphoning the gold from is that co-regulation, which happens in the moment, rather than the self-regulatory process of fantasizing. And sign number 5 that you are almost definitely using limerence as a means of self-regulation is that your romantic fixation on a particular person is serving as a replacement for your genuine needs for intimacy, vulnerability, and true connection with other people. So anytime you feel yourself getting really limerent, getting really fixated on another person and your connection with them, ask yourself, to what extent are my needs for true, deep, intimate, person-to-person connection, not necessarily romantically, just overall, getting met right now? Even if I have a lot of friends or surface-level connections right now, am I actually getting my deeper needs to be seen and known on a very deep level, and to have myself mirrored back to me accurately by someone I have mutual trust with, getting met? Often the reason we develop really intense limerence is because we are terrified of intimacy. So I believe the phenomenon of experiencing limerence is most prevalent among those who struggle with toxic shame. This feeling of, if anyone really saw me or really knew me, they would be disgusted by me and I would be abandoned. However, I still have that need, right? My soul, my inner self is aching for that type of deep connection. And the best way I know at this point to soothe that ache is to imagine it. To create an elaborate fantasy world in which someone looks at all of my inner stuff and goes, oh, this just in, you're actually fine. There's actually nothing to be ashamed of in there. And I know that because I am a perfect person with absolutely no flaws, so I am perfectly qualified to make that call for you. And of course, the actual antidote to this is to learn to be present with the things that we are afraid to look at in ourselves. I have a video called Self-Intimacy, What It Is and How to Foster It, that goes into this process in depth and talks about how we can learn to be present with ourselves in such a way that eventually allows us to welcome in true intimacy from other people that we may have been terrified of for our entire lives. However, it is a process. And once again, the first step in the process is accurately naming what we're experiencing. If we are fixated on a romantic fantasy about another person, and we are using it to self-regulate at the expense of actually going out into the world and forming real, honest, secure relationships with other people that can eventually provide us with true, in-the-moment, interpersonal co-regulation, we're setting ourselves up for a lot of disappointment and heartache, because fantasies do not build real relationships. Present moment connection, which requires us being willing to sit with our own uncomfortable emotions that might arise within present moment connection, is what actually builds deep relationships. I also have a video on interpersonal intimacy that I will link below. But in the meantime, if this is the first time that you are experiencing this problem, so you're just watching this going, holy crap, that's me, what do I do? here are some resources that you might find helpful. I've not currently accessed this one, so I can't speak to it specifically, but there is a 12-step program called Love and Sex Addicts Anonymous that deals quite specifically in its literature and in its meetings with fantasy addiction. I know there are a lot of meetings both online as well as in most major cities, so I will link that resource in the description of this video. Some books I recommend. Dorothy Tenov is the mother of limerent theory. I will link her book below in the description of this video. A book that I found extraordinarily helpful was The Fantasy Bond by Robert Firestone. It doesn't specifically address limerence, however, it goes very deep into why we develop kind of inaccurate representations of relationships inside of our own minds in order to avoid pain and suffering. I will link that below, and I will also just throw in any resources that I can think of that might be helpful here. But the important thing to keep in mind is that having this problem is not inherently shameful. We develop coping mechanisms that later become maladaptive because at some point they were deeply adaptive for us. At some point in our lives, we needed fantasy love to soothe the pain of not having real connection, of not having our authentic selves be truly seen and mirrored back to us by other people. And so we did the best that we could to give that feeling to ourselves in order to stay reasonably regulated, which is a need that we have in order to navigate the world. So instead of shaming or blaming or telling yourself there's something wrong with you for having this tendency, try thanking yourself for developing it at the time when you needed it, and then having a conversation slowly and continuously, if you need to, with your inner child about why you no longer necessarily need this coping mechanism, if it's something that you're wanting to start letting go of. And I will have future videos talking more specifically about how to do that and how to work with limerence in order to stop using it as a replacement for genuine connection and co-regulation. But for now, that's all I'm going to say on the topic today. As always, let me know what's coming up for you guys as you go through this, what you're thinking, feeling, experiencing, wondering about. I love you. I hope you're taking care of yourselves and each other and your inner children, and I will see you back here again really soon.